The moment Richard Castellano looked me in the eye and said those words, I knew my life was about to change forever. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled like some discount villain from a soap opera, and told me I was being let go. When I asked why, after 12 years of perfect performance reviews, he didn't even have the decency to lie convincingly. He said the company was moving in a new direction, that they needed fresh energy, younger faces. Then he paused, looked me up and down with barely concealed disgust, and added that clients expected a certain aesthetic, and at 45, I simply didn't fit the image anymore. Too old, too plain, too invisible. Those were the words he didn't say out loud, but I heard them anyway. They hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire I didn't start but was definitely about to burn in. What Richard didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was that I had just spent the last 6 months quietly acquiring enough shares in Castellano Media Group to become the majority stakeholder. And tomorrow morning, I wasn't walking into that building as Rachel Byan, the forgettable middle-aged project manager they just fired. I was walking in as Rachel Byan, their new CEO. And Richard Castellano was about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating women who have been underestimated their whole lives. My name is Rachel Byan. I'm 45 years old, and I've been invisible for most of them. Not literally invisible, obviously, but the kind of invisible that happens to women after a certain age. The kind where men look right through you in meetings, where your ideas get credited to the junior guy who repeated them louder. Where you stop getting invited to client dinners because you're not decoration anymore, just furniture. I started at Castellano Media Group when I was 33, fresh off a divorce that had drained my bank account and whatever was left of my confidence. I needed work. They needed someone who could organize chaos, and God knows that company was chaos wrapped in expensive suits. I started as an administrative assistant, which is corporate speak for doing everyone else's job while they took the credit. But I didn't mind. I watched. I learned. I made myself indispensable in ways that didn't require me to be young or pretty or whatever it is men like Richard decided had value. Within 3 years, I was a project manager. Within 6, I was running their most profitable accounts. By year 10, I had saved that company from bankruptcy twice, though you wouldn't know it from the org chart. My name never made it onto the leadership announcements. My strategies became Richard's innovations. My client relationships became company assets that somehow had nothing to do with me. And I let it happen because I thought loyalty mattered. I thought competence would eventually be recognized. I thought if I just kept my head down and did excellent work, someone would finally see me. Turns out the only thing people see when you keep your head down is the top of your head, and that's not nearly interesting enough to remember. Everything changed 8 months ago when Richard hired Vanessa Kane as VP of Client Relations, a position that didn't exist until a 28-year-old with an Ivy League degree and legs that went on for days walked into his office. Vanessa was everything I was. Young, polished, the kind of beautiful that makes people forget what you were saying mid-sentence. She had a way of laughing at Richard's jokes that made him think he was funny, which alone deserved some kind of performance award. Within weeks, she was in every meeting I used to run. Within months, my clients were being transferred to her portfolio. When I asked Richard about it, he said Vanessa brought a modern energy that resonated better with their demographic. I asked what demographic required someone under 30 to understand advertising for retirement planning services. He told me I was being defensive. That's when I knew. I was being phased out. Not because I was bad at my job, I was the best they had, but because I had committed the unforgivable sin of aging while female. So I made a decision. If they were going to erase me anyway, I might as well make it count. I started doing research. Castellano Media Group was privately held, but Richard had made the catastrophically stupid decision 5 years ago to sell off shares to raise capital for an expansion that never quite materialized. Those shares had been scattered among small investors, none of whom paid much attention to the company as long as dividends kept coming. I spent 3 months tracking down every shareholder I could find. I used every penny of my savings, took out loans against my house, cashed in retirement accounts I'd been building for 20 years. I bought shares, quietly, carefully, through holding companies and trusts so nobody would connect the purchases back to me. It was risky. It was possibly insane. But you know what's more insane? spending 12 years building someone else's empire while they treat you like expired produce. By month 6, I owned 38% of the company. Not enough to control it outright, but enough to make things very interesting. Then I got lucky. Martin Oakes, one of the original investors who'd backed Richard 20 years ago, called me out of the blue. Apparently, word had gotten around that someone was buying up shares, and Martin wanted to know who and why. I told him the truth. That I'd worked for the company for over a decade, that I'd watched Richard run it into the ground with ego-driven decisions and nepotistic hiring, and that I thought it could be better. Martin listened. Then he laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from deep in the chest and means you've just heard the best joke all year. He told me Richard had screwed him over on a deal 3 years ago, and he'd been waiting for an opportunity to return the favor. 2 days later, Martin sold me his 18% stake at a price that suggested revenge was worth more to him than money. That put me at 56%, majority shareholder, owner. The woman they were about to fire now owned the company that employed them. The irony was so thick you could bottle it and sell it as premium schadenfreude. I didn't tell anyone. I kept showing up to work, kept doing my job, kept watching Vanessa take credit for strategies I'd developed and clients I'd nurtured for years. I watched Richard preen and posture, completely oblivious that the woman he was about to discard owned his entire professional life. And then came the day. Friday afternoon. Richard called me into his office with HR present, which is never a good sign unless you're the one doing the firing. They had my severance package ready, a pathetic sum that barely covered 3 months of expenses after 12 years of service. Richard delivered the news with all the sympathy of someone canceling a subscription service they forgot they had. And when I asked why, he gave me that line about aesthetics and fresh energy and all the corporate euphemisms that mean you're too old and we don't want to look at you anymore. I took the severance package. I signed the non-disclosure agreement they required, which was hilarious considering what I was about to disclose. I shook Richard's hand. I thanked him for the opportunity, and then I walked out of that office for the last time as an employee. On Monday morning, I'd be walking back in as the boss. If you want the full truth, hit like so this story reaches more people. The weekend before the board meeting was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I kept playing out scenarios in my head, imagining Richard's face when he realized what had happened, wondering if I was making a massive mistake or about to have the most satisfying Monday morning in corporate history. Probably both. My lawyer, Patricia DeGroot, had been handling the legal details of the acquisition. She called me Saturday afternoon to confirm everything was in order. The paperwork had been filed. The board had been notified of the change in majority ownership. Monday's emergency meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., attendance mandatory. Patricia asked if I was ready. I told her I'd been ready for 12 years. Sunday night, I stood in front of my closet trying to decide what you wear to your own corporate coup. I settled on a charcoal gray suit, simple but expensive, the kind that whispers power without shouting. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a 45-year-old woman who had earned every inch of the ground she was standing on. Not young. Not trying to be. Just competent, prepared, and about to ruin some well-deserved days. Monday morning arrived with the kind of bright sunshine that felt almost offensive given what I was about to do. I drove to the office in silence, no radio, no podcasts, just the sound of my heartbeat and the voice in my head asking if I was really going through with this. By the time I pulled into the parking garage, that voice had quieted. I was done questioning myself. I had spent 45 years letting other people decide my worth. Today, I was deciding it myself. The building looked the same as it always had, glass and steel, and the kind of modern architecture that's supposed to look innovative but mostly just looks expensive. I walked through the lobby where I'd walked 1,000 times before, but today the security guard actually looked at me. Really looked. Like he knew something had shifted but couldn't quite identify what. I took the elevator to the executive floor, a level I'd only visited when summoned. The doors opened onto polished marble and uncomfortable furniture designed to make you feel small. The conference room was already full. I could see them through the glass walls. Richard at the head of the table, of course, looking annoyed at being called to an emergency meeting. Vanessa beside him, perfectly styled as always. The other board members scattered around, checking phones, drinking coffee, waiting to find out why their Monday morning had been hijacked. Patricia was already there, sitting calmly with a stack of folders in front of her. She caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. I pushed open the conference room door. The conversation stopped. Every head turned. Richard's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion to something that might have been concern. He asked what I was doing there, his tone suggesting I'd wandered into the wrong room by mistake. I smiled. Comment justice if you believe she deserved justice. I told Richard I was there for the board meeting. I said I was sorry I was late and took the empty seat directly across from him. The confusion on his face deepened. He looked at Patricia, then back at me, then at the other board members like someone might explain the joke he wasn't getting. Patricia opened the top folder and slid copies of documents across the table. She stated, for the record, that as of Friday at 5 p.m., I had become the majority shareholder of Castellano Media Group with 56% ownership. She said that according to the corporate bylaws, this granted me the authority to assume the role of CEO, effective immediately. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting for more information, but the stunned silence of people whose entire understanding of reality had just been rewritten. Richard's face went from tan to red to a shade of purple I didn't know human skin could achieve. He said that was impossible, that there must be some mistake. Patricia, bless her, didn't even blink. She said there was no mistake. The documentation was all in order. The transfer of shares was legal and binding. And as of this moment, I was his boss. Richard looked at me like I was a stranger, like the woman he'd fired 3 days ago had been replaced by someone he didn't recognize. And maybe she had been. Maybe I didn't recognize her either. I leaned forward and said that effective immediately, I was restructuring the leadership team. I said Richard's services were no longer required. I told him he could clear out his office by end of day. Then I turned to Vanessa, whose perfect composure had finally cracked, and told her we'd be reviewing all client accounts she'd taken over to ensure proper transition protocols had been followed. Her face went pale. Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once. Richard tried to speak, but nothing coherent came out. Finally, he managed to ask how I could possibly have afforded this, where the money came from. I told him I'd been saving for years, that while he was buying sports cars and taking expensive vacations, I was building something that actually mattered. I said every dollar I earned, every bonus I was given instead of a promotion I deserved, every penny I didn't spend trying to look younger or more acceptable, went into this moment. I told him underestimating me was the most expensive mistake he'd ever made. And then I said the words I'd been rehearsing all weekend. I told him that at 45, I might be too old and too ugly for his aesthetic, but I was exactly the right age to take everything he'd built and make it better. The board meeting lasted another hour, but the real business was done in those first 5 minutes. Richard left. Vanessa followed. And I sat in that conference room, in the chair I'd earned, finally visible. Share this video so communities understand what was hiding. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. It's patient. It's watching people underestimate you while you quietly buy the ground they're standing on. And then, when they've forgotten you exist, you remind them exactly who you've always been.